And the nice thing that particular prayer is in the Hallel service, so we get to do it a lot during the year, every holiday, every Rosh Chodesh. So this week, we have a law in the Torah reading that is bizarre. It's really bizarre. But it helps us learn a lot, and we learn a lot about it through Moses Maimonides. So we get to learn something about Moses Maimonides tonight and something about this very weird law. The rabbis believed that there were certain laws in the Torah that had no explanation, no understanding. And they interpret that to mean that that was like an act of faith. You follow the law, and even though you don't understand what it is. To jump forward, Maimonides didn't agree with that. Maimonides was a rationalist, right? Everything has meaning and purpose to him. You may not figure it out. It may take generations to figure it out, but you got to dig. You got to dig deep. And as you do that, you're going to expose all sorts of meanings. So that the Torah is not challenging us to faith. The Torah is challenging us to learn, to study, to challenge ourselves. So what's this law? It's called the red heifer. You heard about a red heifer? Okay, it's actually not a red heifer. It's a brown heifer, but they translated it red heifer, so now it's a red heifer. And the law is this. When somebody enters into a state of impurity, in that period of time, impurities were very important. They had to be dealt with. And the highest state of impurity was death. So if you happen to come into contact with death physically, near someone who's passed away or touched someone who was in the same room, you became ritually impure. You couldn't approach the altar and offer a sacrifice. So you had to have a way to become pure again, right? So this is what the Torah devises in tomorrow's Torah reading. You take this perfect red heifer without a blemish on it. On the side, those who want to bring back the temple and go back 2,000 years and offer sacrifices, they're trying to raise a perfect red heifer. This is what they're spending their time doing. And where do you think they did it? Texas. Not in Israel. They did it in Texas, and then they went back to Israel. They're still working on it. It should take a few more generations to figure it out. But the Torah says you take this red heifer without a blemish, you slaughter it, and you burn it to ashes. You take the ashes and you mix them with water, and then that concoction, sounds like Harry Potter, right? I think I'm like Hogwarts, right? That concoction you then use to purify the person who's become impure from having come into contact with death. Torah doesn't explain why that works. What is the red heifer and burning the ashes and putting in the water and sprinkling it on the person? What does it got to do with anything? Why does that purify someone? And there's no answer. But here's another catch to it. Obviously, one of the Kohanim, one of the priests, has to slaughter and burn the heifer, right? That's their job. That's what they do, the Kohanim on the altar. When they do that and then create this potion, they become impure. Right? The one who creates the potion to make somebody pure himself becomes impure and has to go through the ritual. Why does he become impure? So these are questions that some of the rabbis would say, we don't know, we follow in this faith in God. And Rambam said, no, you got to dig deep. There's a reason here. And he admits he doesn't know what the reason is. But what he will never say is that we have laws or rituals that don't have meaning. He couldn't accept that as a rationalist. Because if a law and a ritual doesn't have meaning, people are going to stop doing it. It has to have meaning. So he dug deep. And what we found, what Rambam and others found, we didn't find an answer yet as to why that concoction will make you pure. But he looked at something that he thought was deeper. He said, look, let's talk about this Kohen who became impure in order to make people pure. Maybe there's a lesson there. And what we see there is this Kohen who lives on this status, right, up here. He gets to approach the altar. He's in a state of purity. In order to help the community, he goes down into the impurity himself. He gets down into the dirt. He gets into the mud something a Kohen would never do voluntarily. It's only an accident if they do it. But no, this is voluntary. He goes into the mud and he lifts that person back up into purity. Back, in other words, back into the community. Back into a normal life. If he's not willing to get into that mud, if he's not willing to go down to that level, he can't lift up his community. So the lesson that is seen here is that sometimes it's necessary for leaders, if they really want to lift up the community, they got to go down into the mud. They got to go where the problem really is and immerse themselves in it. Not stand here at the altar looking down and saying, oh, you're impure. Here's stuff, go sprinkle yourself. No, get down with that person who's now isolated because of the impurity. Share that impurity with them, and together they lift each other up. The Kohen learns a very important lesson there. They can't remain here all the time. They can't help their community if they're going to be up here in the altar looking down at everybody, not experiencing. So take the impurity as something, as a metaphor, or something interpreted a different way. So what struck me was that one of the great problems we have with many leaders, political leaders today, is that they really have never experienced the problems that they're trying to solve. They don't really know what it is. They don't understand. So they can't really lift the people up until they get down and experience the problem. And I thought of that literally the other day when I was shopping, and the person in front of me started to put things on the side. Said, no, forget this, forget that. And what became clear to myself and the person who was, checking him through the lane was, this person couldn't afford everything that they had picked. They had to choose what they were going to take home. They ran out of their budget because they hadn't anticipated the inflation. It was so high that what they used to buy, they couldn't buy now. And everything was handled with dignity. But I realized, thank God most people don't go through that, but there are apparently, we know a lot of Americans going through that. And then we have politicians trying to solve it. Well, if they don't experience that, if they don't understand what that is, if they don't get down in there and really see what's going on, they can't fix it. That's what the lesson is. If the Kohen could bring himself to get down into the mud, to become impure himself, which is a difficult thing for a Kohen, to have to go through the process of purifying himself so he could go back up to the community with this person who, to no fault of his own or her own, has become impure. It happened. Then you can't fix the problem because you really don't understand the problem. So what the rabbis who said, there's always a lesson to be learned. Don't back off and say, I don't understand it. It's just a test. We'll follow it because God's testing us. And no, the test is, can you dig down deep and really learn the many lessons that are contained in this mysterious ritual? And that's one of the lessons, that in order to really help people, you have to get down into their level. You have to experience what they're experiencing so that you can really understand the pain or the sense of being out of the community, a sense of hopelessness, a sense of being disconnected. Until you get down with them and experience it, you can't solve the problem. It's true also in war, right? I was just, American history buff, I like to watch it. They're doing this thing about George Washington. It's a really good series. And at one point, George Washington is trying to explain to the British. It was before the British were our enemies. It's when they were allies in the French and Indian War, right? He's trying to explain, no, you can't fight the way you fought in Europe. This is a different country. It's a different land. The people you're fighting have completely different tactics. And the general said, we don't go down to that level. We don't fight like that. And of course, by the end of the day, the general was dead and his army was decimated. Washington learned a great deal in the French Indian War about how to be a general against the British, because 10 years later they were our enemies. And they lost the war. And we have to understand what Israel's going through. She's fighting the most evil enemy that has no rules, no humanity, couldn't care less about international law, right? The only thing that international law does is help terrorists. That's who it helps, right? So we have to understand, and there isn't enough understanding out there, particularly in the media, that Israel has to, in order to win the war, in order to defeat the terrorism, in order to secure the country, in order to get back the hostages, is going to have to really get down and dirty and to a level that normally she wouldn't want to go to. That's not how she fights wars, but sometimes there's no choice but to get down in the mud in order to accomplish the goal. For the Kohen, it was to get down in the mud to lift this person up from impurity. I'll have to become impure myself. That's the lesson. And Israel, in fighting this war, just sometimes has to get to a level that she's not comfortable with, but there's no choice. It has to be done in order to win the battle and to help the Palestinians. Because if they're still under Hamas, they have a miserable life. Their only hope is for Hamas to be defeated and for a new government to rise that actually cares about them and about the civilians. But it will be a war that's going to be very difficult, is very difficult right now for Israel to fight, but can look at this week's parsha and say sometimes in order to lift up the other, we have to get down into the dirt, and then together we rise up again and build a better future. So it's a beautiful lesson. Moses Maimonides challenged us, never give up. Whatever that law or ritual is, you don't understand it, keep asking, keep digging. Eventually we will find an answer as to what the meaning of that mysterious Torah law is. Shabbat Shalom.